This is Yosef. I'm going to try a different method than usual to record some thoughts on Jonathan Pageau's, his first four chapters of, first four chapters of Exodus here. It's going to be a pseudo-running commentary. I will see if this works. I'm not going to record him and then myself, I don't think. So once again, I am driving. Let's see. And yes, before I start, Paul, you really should do an Exodus seminar. TLC Exodus seminar. I think it'd be awesome. I mean, yes, some sort of Bible study, but Exodus makes a lot of sense. I think they'll have lots of interesting people. Yeah, so anyway, back to Pageau. So I think, yes, this microcosm, nice idea. I mean, I think it's certainly have no parallel sources on the Jewish side. 70 nations, 70 people. A couple small things. The text focuses on how, especially later when it retells this part, how few they were in number when they went down to Egypt. That comes up first time in Deuteronomy, but also comes up in a couple other places. And this is the smallest among nations, a small seed that's going to grow into this big thing.
In a quarter mile, keep right at the fork to stay on I-495 north.
And the other thing that's worth noting is when it talks about them becoming numerous and multitudinous, is using the words for
keep right at the fork to stay on I-495
from
north.
Genesis, right? So this is basically a direct response, in some ways, to the creation story.
In 1.5 miles, take exit 36 for Old Georgetown Road, Maryland 187 south toward Bethesda.
The first couple chapters of Genesis and the first couple chapters of Exodus, so this is kind of a new creation. This time the creation of the nation as opposed to the creation of humanity as a whole, right? So we're going from the universal to the particular. And it's somewhat ironic, right? If you think back to Genesis, when Lot sees Sodom, he just come from Egypt with Abraham and Sarah, and that story, by the way, prefigures this one. I mean, a lot of stories in Genesis will kind of prefigure the Exodus in many ways. So in that one, for instance, there are words used about Abraham's being a sojourner that are going to be used again here in Exodus. And when he comes out with great wealth, and it's a weird, it's not a particularly common phrase coming out with, or not wealth actually, it's really property, rechush gadol. And let's go over. Yeah, so this idea is that this is kind of repeating what happened both for the first time that Abraham went down and came out of Egypt. It's also repeating the Hagar Ishmael story with roles reversed. So Sarah afflicts. There's three different words: afflict, oppress. I don't know how to translate them, honestly. There's three different words for oppression.
In a quarter mile, take exit 36 for Old Georgetown Road, Maryland 187 south toward Bethesda.
And then all three of those words, again, individually they're not necessarily rare, but in combination they certainly are. The only other time I think they appear might be in the book of Kings, when it's the beginning of Kings, when it's, well, not beginning, but...
Take exit 36, then keep right at the fork.
When it's talking about Solomon and kind of comparing how he built the temple to being a pharaoh, and using forced labor, and kind of there's a big undergirding social critique in Kings 1. Kings
Keep
1.
right at the fork.
Probably chapter 10 or 11, I'm gonna guess, if I'm doing this off the top of my head. So somewhere in there, yeah. So here we
continue on Maryland 187 south for 3/4 of a mile.
This is the library, all these internal references that the Bible consists of. Goodness, okay. So, I say? So yeah, there, and in fact, the rabbis connect that in multiple ways, in interesting and most useful in multiple ways. So there's one reading that says, basically, that Egypt is essentially to teach, for all the good qualities that Abraham and Sarah have, there's still things that they need to learn. That is part of why there are all these tests. And one of the reasons potentially why the Jews have to go to Egypt is to learn an empathy with the slave or servant, which is obviously a very major theme in the rest of the Torah, and even in the prophets, that you had to be slaves in order to properly empathize with the slave. Oh, not the slaves, slaves and strangers and oppressed, in order to empathize with the slave and the stranger and the oppressed when you have your own society. You have to have that formative experience, even if it's historical. You don't have to, not every individual necessarily has to personally experience it, but the nation has to as a whole, in order to inculcate the right moral perspective on everything, on the function of morality and law, and narrative, and that's kind of where it's coming from. So there's a reading that essentially Sarah afflicted Hagar. They had to learn these values through the Exodus. There's another reading going back to Abraham in Egypt, that goes even further, right? That says, and this is
in a quarter mile, turn left onto West Cedar Lane.
In some ways, even that really Abraham's choices in how he, and how he had Sarah lie about being his sister, and then that lie resulting in her being captured, and almost manhandled, mistreated, results in essentially
take the next left onto West Cedar Lane.
This kind of measure for measure punishment, that his descendants would have to go through this, to see what she was subjected to, which is interesting. I don't know. It's certainly a critique of Abraham's treatment of Sarah. I don't think it's as strong of a reading as the Hagar one, but such a reading exists. It's pretty traditional. I think it goes back to the Ramban, so 1300 or so. And he's not the only one who says it, but not a lot of people pick up on that until, I would say, the modern period, where you start having kind of, let's say, more sensitive commentaries that really start questioning Abraham's actions in this area. Anyway, I know I've just jumped multiple tangents, going back a little bit more. So Lot, he comes out of Egypt with Abraham and all the property that they get, in exchange for the mistreatment of Sarah, which could have been worse, but it was bad. I mean, bad enough. But God stepped in at the last minute. So that's an important Exodus theme. God stepping in at the last minute. Going back now, Lot says Abraham had too much property. They can't both live in the land. And he looks at Sodom. You all know Sodom, famous for its own stories. Importantly, though, for our sake, is he says Sodom looks like Egypt. It's like well-watered, like Egypt, so the Nile, right? He's making a connection between those two things. And like the Garden of
Continue
God,
for 3 miles.
An Edenic reference. So one would have thought that would mean it's a great place. That Eden, it's good to have surplus water, vegetation, lots of good cultivation of crops. Of course, the Bible, right, is kind of a polemic against it in many ways, though, right? So here's the flip side, where that exact place, Eden, its waters are the waters that feed into the, well, however you want to take it, metaphorically, literally, symbolically, allegorically, the waters of Eden feed into the 4 major rivers of, minimally, Egypt, the Nile, and then the two rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates. We don't really know what the fourth river is. There's a couple of theories of where and how it works, but it seems to be connecting Eden to the empires of the world, and to wealth, right? The land where good gold comes from, and that those are connected to corruption, right? That empires have, and the wealth of empires, and empires specifically, maybe it's not empires, but civilizations that are river based, essentially is corrupting. I mean, this is an interesting kind of current in Eden, because you would have thought Eden was perfect, and maybe in a river in that context, maybe it could work, but in the context of the world beyond Eden, rivers do not work. That is for sure. So, and why is it corrupting? Well, this is easy, because the Bible tells us a lot of places. Wealth corrupts, one problem. And two, having a reliable and stable source of water means that people aren't aware of their dependence and on the vagaries kind of nature in the world, and therefore their dependence on God. Right? In chapter 2, beginning of Genesis, I don't know, verse 6 or something, 7. Chapter 2, verse 6, it's going to say something like, there's no man yet on the earth, and God hadn't brought forth water, and the Jewish commentaries say that's because man hadn't prayed yet. Man hadn't recognized his dependence on God, and therefore water hadn't been sent to water the crops, or the fields, to provide. And the idea that Jeshurun gets fat and kicks, Deuteronomy, the idea that you'll think that if you have great wealth, somehow you earned it, that it's your righteousness and not, well, in Deuteronomy, your ancestors, right? I mean, it's for God says it was because I loved your fathers that I gave you this land, not because anything you did. You didn't necessarily deserve it. But you could deserve it if you keep the commandments, and follow my law, and especially treat the land and the stranger and properly, right? Those are the big reasons that are given both in Leviticus and Deuteronomy for why they can get kicked out of the land. And they have to always remember that God is the one that provides the water, right? He's the one that's going to cause the rain and the dew to fall. And if you have a river, you're going to forget that. So, going back. Excellent. Egypt. So it's kind of like a Garden of Eden, a new creation. You have the people multiplying, but of course it's not in Eden, and it is corrupt. And there's a lot of problems, right? Pharaoh doesn't know who Joseph is, and that's gonna, by not know, doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't know, but he doesn't seem to acknowledge or have awareness of his history. And what happens when you don't know your history, well, both good and bad things, I guess. It's not necessarily always bad, but the Bible certainly, in this case, isn't so happy about it. But yeah, I mean, Pageau's right. He's going to go into a bit about how Joseph was the one that set up the system, the current land system. I mean, there's a lot more to be developed here than I think he goes into, if I remember. But Joseph was the one that set up the system of where people don't really own their land. The king of Egypt owns all the land except for the land of the priests, and everyone pays 20%, 1/5 of their seed or crop or seed to Pharaoh, except for, again, the priests. That's a result of the famine, and there's quite a lot of parallels that have been drawn between the 7 years of famine and the 7-year sabbatical cycle, where they're kind of, Joseph's thing is almost the opposite of the sabbatical cycle and Jubilee, where people are removed from their land, they're put into debt. Yeah, it's great that I guess the priests are exempt or whatever, though of course that strengthens a pagan priesthood, which might be problematic, but at least in the context of the Bible, where okay, so the priests are exempt, it's also seen as excessive, 20%. Sorry, right. where the Bible brings that down to a tenth, or a tenth and a little bit. Well, actually, the priests get a lot less than that. Honestly, the priests get truma, which we don't have an exact amount, but let's say is between a 50th and a 100th. It's 1 to 2%. The Levites or the poor are the ones that get the 10%. So yeah, I think there's a pretty interesting little jab here at the priests getting too much, and then you get the corruption of the state. And Pharaoh's afraid. What is Pharaoh afraid of? He's afraid of a rebellion. He's afraid of the stranger. He doesn't remember the good that Joseph did, but he does see the potential threat. And if we look at the historical stuff and whether the Jews, how they fit into the whole kind of Hyksos, story, but they were Semitic peoples who were in Egypt probably around the same time, or maybe a little earlier, that had basically their own dynasties, and had removed the native Egyptian ones, or forced them at least to, let's say, Upper Egypt, and set up their own kingdom in Lower Egypt. And we don't exactly know how everything fits together, but it is potentially likely that that's what's happening here. Is this Pharaoh is most likely a native, and he is afraid of basically a repeat of a new Semitic kingdom coming in, and it's kind of taking over again, and he knows that whether we don't know much about the Jews' politics at this time, the Israeli politics at this time, but certainly in the past, Semitic groups have worked together, tribes or whatever, to hit the Egyptians, and he probably fears that they would ally with other Semites or even other groups that the Egyptians aren't so nice to, like the Nubians, and lead a rebellion. So yeah. Goodness. Okay. Pageau does go into the Abraham part, which was great, and then he moves on and makes the comparison to Babel, which I think is a fair comparison. No problems there. I think he kind of gets hung up on this gender thing here a little bit. The most famous understanding of this Jewishly is from the Passover Seder. It's probably going to be one of the most well-known set of exegesis, because anyone who's ever been to a Passover Seder will have encountered it, which is much broader than usually you get, exposure to other, let's say, midrashim, Jewish parables. So there's a couple of things here. One,
in 800 feet, use any lane to turn left onto Connecticut Avenue.
Reproducing, for sure, in multiple ways. Not just killing the children. We also have more exegetical readings that look at they worked the men hard in ways so that they, basically didn't have the energy to have kids. But we also actually put a heavy concentration, the rabbis point this out, that women play an incredibly important role in the Exodus and in the redemption story. One that can't really be ignored or dismissed easily. And it's interesting because in some ways that's started by Pharaoh. Pharaoh, by putting the focus on women and what women could do, and then women that essentially hit back. Both here with the midwives, and then we're going to have with Moses, his sister and his mother, and his sister in multiple contexts. One here when she goes to get watches him from the rushes and goes to get the mom to nurse him. Later, she'll play a role at this at the Song of the Sea. And in general,
use any lane to turn left onto Connecticut
Midrashim
Avenue.
Expand here and talk about like the women made a great effort to make sure that their husbands basically had kids and kept having kids even when they were tired and even when they were being worked hard and oppressed, and like weren't up for it. Like then the role of the women played, and then there's this, and of course they have a special thing at the tabernacle, right? It's at the tabernacle that they donate their mirrors to make the basin, and that was just a whole other discussion for the second half of Exodus, maybe, or when you get there. But yeah, they seem to play some unique roles. I will go back to his discussion on the stranger a little bit. I don't know that we're saying exactly the same thing. I don't know how far we're different. I think here maybe just a difference of framing, where Jews learn about extracting, let's say, knowledge from the world of wisdom, general revelation, not specific, not Torah knowledge, other knowledge. We derive that not from here at all, but from the idea that Shem, the son of Noah, is going to. So when Ham and Canaan get cursed at the end of the Noah story, it says that Shem will dwell. Yefet will dwell in the tents of Shem, right? Or Shem will dwell in the tents of Yefet. Either way. So basically, no, it's the other way. It's Yefet will dwell. Yeah, Yefet will dwell in the tents of Shem, and Yefet, of course, is the progenitor of Yavan, Greece, as well as a whole bunch of other places like that. Eastern Mediterranean, or Mediterranean in general. So we see this as kind of that's where the rabbis at least learn about the synthesis, and they don't see it as a plundering, they see it as a dwelling together, and a brotherly integration. It also comes up in the Jacob Esau stories, where kind of the somewhat unfulfilled, ultimately unfulfilled, or yet to be fulfilled, integration of the two twins that could have been one, and weren't, instead of which they became a contest between the two, Philo and Ikea. They
continue for 3 miles.
Beat each other. Should have not, right? I mean, maybe they should have found a way to kind of coexist a little better. And that is the blessing of Noah to his other sons that clothed him when he was vulnerable. So I think that that framing is fundamentally different from the plundering framing, because one is, let's say, much more harmonious, and it also doesn't view the stuff from the outsider. And this was so ironic, right? Because I would say that Christianity in general is much more open about what it will integrate from, especially pagan Greek, Greco-Roman culture, but pagan cultures in general compared to Judaism. On the other hand, we also, from the difference in framing, like one would think the Jewish approach is less antagonistic. We're not trying to like exploit or extract and like use it for our own gain or good. It's not seen as kind of like taking it from you because you don't, I need it, you can't use it properly, whatever. It's also, he used the word offered by the Egyptians, which is funny. I mean, so it is offered, it's kind of coarse, but offered, it might be a little bit strong, but I think the text somewhere does use that language at least once. Right? So they let them borrow their wealth. But I think it's worth kind of flipping the frame a little bit, because we don't read it this way. We read it a little differently, and it's connected to sending out of this in the law, right? But this is the narrative and law are not separate for us, right? The narrative and that's something else we should talk about at some point. But narrative and normative are not separate not really separate in the Bible, especially in Torah. They're very deeply intertwined. So here we see this as connected to the law about sending out your slave after they've worked for you for the completed amount of time with great wealth. That it's not exactly that you owe them compensation for underpaying them in the past, because the Israelite laws for slavery tend to be pretty yeah, I mean, they get compensated fairly well. It's not exactly like, yeah, it's not modern chattel slavery that we picture. That's the wrong picture of Israelite slavery, especially of Israelite slavery over other Israelites. We can talk about the other type of slaveries, but Israelite bondage to other Israelites, you have to send them out with great wealth because they're your brother, and also like you benefited greatly from their work over the years, and it's a parting gift, and it's not something that you owe them, but like it's part of the expectation of the law of how you should treat someone, because they were in an unfortunate situation, and they'll need something to help them get started again after 7 years away from their lives. And it's not just that you send them with great wealth. You're supposed to send them with song, and the big meal, and make sure that like they understand that you appreciated them. So yeah, it's a very different look it's a very different take than a plundering take. Which, is what it is. So the next part. So if the beginning of Genesis, of Exodus was the beginning of Genesis, so that now we're in the Noah story. I like kind of how he's doing the imagery here. I think that's not going to quite work, because of course the Jewish baby boys don't get killed, right? It's in a kind of an aborted destruction that doesn't actually end up happening, but it's certainly envisioned as similar to the flood, a watery destruction of the people, and in some ways it also reminds us kind of God saying, I'll return the world to chaos. I'll return it to tohu and vohu. But God promised, right? God promised that there would not be another flood. And I think that's kind of also what's being played with here. It's not just that there's a flood, but the promise that it won't happen again. And especially not to these people who descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, I think again, so he's going to always go on the gender thing. He has a very strong reading in that direction that I don't necessarily fully agree or see. I don't see feminine water as clearly, I guess, in the Jewish symbolic world of Judaism as he sees it. I do definitely see water as a major theme in Moses' life, though. I think there's something to be said. There's a whole area to be explored there on how water constantly plays a role from the moment he's born until his death in his life, from the sea, from hitting the rock, providing water to the nation. Moses is the he's both water born and the water bearer, and yeah, there's something to be said about that. Now, with his naming, this of course is a very kind of funky thing that happens, right? Because we have a Hebrew etymology for his name, and we know, because we know ancient Egyptian, that his name also has a meaning in Egyptian. It just means son. But unlike, let's say, so one of the source cities that they were building was Ramses, right? Ramses. What does that mean? Right? That's the son of Ra, right? The sun god of the Egyptians. But he's, right? And this is a point Rabbi Sachs makes, that Moses is just a son. He's just a kid who has no identity. His parents, in this version of the story, right, in a couple of chapters, they're going to tell the same exact story, but give these people names. But here, they're just a woman and a man, and his sister. and the child and the baby. They're nameless. He's just a guy. He's yet another baby. There's no reason to think that he's special, that anything would happen. There are Midrashim that say that his mother knew he was special in various ways, but the plain text does not indicate that he's special. And in some ways, it seems to be, you think, essentially, right? You're having the protagonist and antagonist being set up here. That the antagonist thinks he's the son of a god, right? This is the divinity, he's a divinity himself, who's the son of a divinity, and he's going to face off against just a nameless baby. This baby is going to take him down, who has not divine, no claim of anything necessarily special, doesn't even have a name. We know what I think here we know what tribe he's from. That's basically it. It's a powerful message that kind of sets up the dynamic between these two. Ultimately, that will come to a climax in a bit, in a couple, 8 chapters. Then, of course, you have the Hebrew meaning of the name, that she's drawing him forth from the water. It's interesting because there's some parallel here between, he cries, he's called a Na'ar, which is weird because he's a baby, he's still 3 months old, but a Na'ar is usually used for the youth, a young teenager. And it's connected very specifically to a different water story, which is Yishmael. Yishmael cries, and God hears him and takes him out, and shows his mother where the water is, to help him. And it's interesting to think about. Yishmael usually we wouldn't necessarily think of as positive character, but we did connect Hagar a little bit to the Exodus story already. And in what ways Moshe and Yishmael might be connected, or contrasted maybe even here are interesting, right? It's their cries save them. When one gets noticed by God, the other gets noticed by the Egyptian princess, the daughter of Pharaoh. They're both cast out of their houses. Both children are alone. Right? Ishmael gets left under he's older, but he gets left under a thorn bush, interestingly enough. Something to talk about later. And then there's kind of this in-between liminal figure, right? You have the daughter of Pharaoh's handmaid goes to get the kid, and you have the angel of God showing Hagar where the water is. There seems to be some sort of interesting parallels being set up between these guys. Anyway, so I thought I was going to get through all 4 first chapters. I think I got through part of the first one, but this was fun. I think I can do this again. I'm going to check the quality, but otherwise, look forward to doing more.